Marius, meantime, was reading freely, in early morning for the most part, those writers chiefly who had made it their business to know what might be thought concerning that strange, enigmatic personal essence which had seemed to go out altogether, along with the funeral fires, and the old Greek who more than any other was now giving form to his thoughts was a very hard master. From Epicurus, from the thunder and lightning of Lucretius, like thunder and lightning some distance off, one might recline to enjoy, in a garden of roses. He had gone back to the writer, who was in a certain sense the teacher of both, Heraclitus of Ionia. His difficult book concerning nature was even then rare, for people had long since satisfied themselves by the quotation of certain brilliant isolated oracles only, out of what was at best a taxing kind of law. But the difficulty of the early Greek prose did but spur the curiosity of Marius, the writer, the superior clearness of whose intellectual view had so sequestered him from other men, who had had so little of joy of that superiority, being avowedly exacting as to the amount of devout attention he required from the student. The many, he said, always thus emphasizing the difference between the many and the few, are like people heavy with wine, led by children, knowing not whither they go. And yet much learning doth not make wise. And again, the ass, after all, would have his thistles rather than fine gold. Heraclitus, indeed, had not underrated the difficulty for the many of the paradox with which his doctrine begins, and the due reception of which must involve a denial of habitual impressions as the necessary first step in the way of truth. His philosophy had been developed in conscious, outspoken opposition to the current mode of thought, as a matter requiring some exceptional loyalty to pure reason and its dry light. Men are subject to an illusion, he protests, regarding matters apparent to sense. What the uncorrected sense gives was a false impression of permanence or fixity in things, which have really changed their nature in the very moment in which we see and touch them. And the radical flaw in the current mode of thinking would lie herein, that, reflecting this false or uncorrected sensation, it attributes to the phenomena of experience a durability which does not really belong to them. Imaging forth from those fluid impressions a world of firmly outlined objects, it leads one to regard as a thing stark and dead what is in reality full of animation, of vigor, of the fire of life, that eternal process of nature, of which at a later time Goethe spoke as the living garment, whereby God is seen of us, ever in weaving at the loom of time. And the appeal which the old Greek thinker made was, in the first instance, from confused to unconfused sensation, with a sort of prophetic seriousness, a great claim and assumption, such as we may understand, if we anticipate in this preliminary skepticism the ulterior scope of his speculation, according to which the universal movement of all natural things is but one particular stage, or measure, of that ceaseless activity wherein the divine reason consists. The one true being, that constant subject of all early thought, it was his merit to have conceived, not as sterile and stagnant in action, but as a perpetual energy, from the restless stream of which, at certain points, some elements detach themselves and harden into nonentity in death, corresponding, as outward objects, to man's inward condition of ignorance, that is, to the slowness of his faculties. It is with this paradox of a subtle, perpetual change in all visible things that the high speculation of Heraclitus begins. Hence the scorn he expresses for anything like a careless, half-conscious use and wont reception of our experience, which took so strong a hold on men's memories. Hence those many precepts towards a strenuous self-consciousness in all we think and do, that loyalty to cool and candid reason, which makes strict attentiveness of mind a kind of religious duty and service. The negative doctrine, then, that the objects of our ordinary experience, fixed as they seem, are really in perpetual change, had been, as originally conceived, but the preliminary step towards a large, positive system of almost religious philosophy. Then as now, the illuminated philosophic mind might apprehend, in what seemed a mass of lifeless matter, the movement of that universal life, in which things and men's impressions of them were ever coming to be, alternately consumed and renewed. That continual change to be discovered by the attentive understanding, where common opinion found fixed objects, was but the indicator of a subtler, all-pervading motion, the ceaseless, ever-sustained, inexhaustible energy of the divine reason itself, proceeding always by its own rhythmical logic, and lending to all mind and matter in turn what life they had. In this perpetual flux of things and of souls, there was, as Heraclitus conceived, a continuance, if not of their material or spiritual elements, yet of orderly intelligible relationships, like the harmony of musical notes, wrought out in and through the series of their mutations, ordinances of the divine reason, maintained throughout the changes of the phenomenal world, and this harmony in their mutation and opposition was, after all, a principle of sanity, of reality there. But it happened that, of all this, the first, merely skeptical or negative step, that easiest step on the threshold, had alone remained in general memory, and the doctrine of motion seemed to those who had felt its seduction to make all fixed knowledge impossible. The swift passage of things, the still swifter passage of those modes of our conscious being which seemed to reflect them, might indeed be the burning of the divine fire, but what was ascertained was that they did pass away like a devouring flame, or like the race of water in the midstream, too swiftly for any real knowledge of them to be attainable. Heracliteanism had grown to be almost identical with the famous doctrine of the sophist Protagoras, that the momentary, sensible apprehension of the individual was the only standard of what is or is not, and each one the measure of all things to himself. The impressive name of Heraclitus had become but an authority for a philosophy of the despair of knowledge.